One of my favorite things about video games is how sometimes a developer can take a game concept and then turn it into something completely new by simply changing a few details on a superficial level. In the case of today's video, what happens when we take the guns and replace them with magic wands and medieval weapons? We get a Medieval. A game that, while I learned is a spiritual successor to Heretic, I couldn't help but feel like it was leaning a lot more towards the Quake of the boomer shooter spectrum. I say this because thanks to a good friend of mine, I got to experience the original Quake, and going from there to a Medieval, I couldn't help but notice the shooting and the movement felt fairly similar to it. So before we go any deeper, let's cover the basics first. Again, being a boomer shooter is mostly flavor, but it's still worth mentioning. In a Medieval, the gods have become corrupted, their worlds turned dark, and the universe is in great peril. The last remaining goddess has chosen us to play as the champion, a mortal pulled into the realm of the gods, in order to purge their evil and put an end to the source of the corruption.
Save our lives.
And that's about it. This is where my Quakey feelings for this game begin. Much like with the original Quake, you are set in a hub world that lets you choose your difficulty and has all the main worlds unlocked for you to freely choose the order you want to do them in. The catch is that every world you go into will start you with just your basic axe, needing you to find and collect your weapons from scratch, so the only thing separating you from difficulty spikes is how good you get with the combat as you make progress. And the combat is a thing of true beauty. It's not as visceral as Doom or as gritty as Quake. What the game doesn't have in blood and gore, however, it has it in some very satisfying ways to kill your enemies. One of the most important aspects in a first-person shooter is making sure the shooting feels good, both with sound, how it affects enemies, and the damage you can make with it. Even though you are using magic projectiles, the game still manages to give them that same feeling. The way combat encounters are paced out helps them shine even more. To elaborate, most boomer shooters are paced in the same way. You explore a level, fight a few enemies here and there, find your keys to progress, and then you have major battles sprinkled in between, usually in the middle of the level or at the end. Early encounters are perfect because they are giving you a chance to try out your new weapons in a more controlled environment. This helps you get accustomed to how they work, and as you make progress through the level, the game gives you encounters where you can actually unload all the ammo you collected. Or I should say, mana you collected. Or if you are low on a certain weapon, to clear out the enemies while replenishing a weapon you likely nearly emptied by then. Staying true to the design of boomer shooters of old, the pacing of the levels is really good. While it's true that relentless action is the creme de la creme of the genre, what helps digest said action is the exploration. I'll elaborate more on this later, but in general, the levels in this game do a really good job at letting you loose and looking around to your heart's content. Either by scavenging for ammo after a particularly tough battle, looking for the secrets if you are looking to go for full completion, and of course, some good old-fashioned platforming. Some of the levels in this game have a surprising degree of verticality. It's not often, but when it happens, it adds to the spectacle of each world. It helps get you immersed, and it also gives you a slight sense of intimidation, because these larger-than-life areas remind you of how small and insignificant your player character feels, and making it the more satisfying as you defeat your obstacles. More importantly, it gives you breathing room, so you can cool down for the most recent gunfight and get yourself mentally prepared for the next encounter. Because, like a pulsing heart, the game will then throw all caution out of the window and give you a larger battle for you to litter the floor with corpses. Now, because this is a fantasy-themed game, killing enemies lets you collect their soul power, and said soul power builds up a special bar that, once it fills up, it lets you temporarily shoot a super enhanced version of your arsenal. The magic wand becomes a minigun, the sword a shotgun that slices through enemies and bounces off walls. The ice wand becomes a super shotgun that lets you pin even more enemies to the walls. And of course, it would be a disservice to this game if I didn't mention the freaking planet launcher that becomes a sun launcher that can wipe out entire crowds for you. And as before talking about the biggest crowd control of what I can only call, I can't believe it's not the VFG 9000. You get the idea. But not all of the shooting is mindless. Some of the game worlds carry smaller enemies and mini-bosses, depending on how much ammo you have. You will adapt your playstyle and your weapons of choice accordingly. It's not much, but it helps you play smart, even in the heat of battle. And you really need it for the bosses. The main bosses in each world have their own theme and attack patterns, and all of them put everything you learn over the course of the run to the test. But enough about shooting. I can only gush so much about how good it feels, so now let's get to elaborate on the game world itself. Being a fantasy game can have its own set of trappings regardless of the genre. This game could have easily gone with a typical medieval castle and grey knights in shining armor, or its creepy dungeons and caves. Instead, a medieval takes the idea of fantasy and goes full eye candy with it. Not only with the aesthetic of intimidatingly huge structures and colorful color palettes, but also by making it into a pure atmospheric light show. If not from the environment, from enemy projectiles and your own powers. I don't always comment on graphics because visuals are always secondary to me, but I think for this game it needs to be said. For as much as rendering tech continues to create computer melting eye candy, art style also goes a long way into making those bells and whistles make the game into such a gorgeous spectacle. Even without ray tracing, because my GPU is sold by today's standards, this game is a treat to look at. These worlds are not just video games arenas for you to have exciting battles in. It's also a world that feels lived in. Or at the very least, these places do look like a civilization used to live in it before the corruption took over and turned everyone into mindless monsters. This, and the small lore text scattered around the levels, give the game a nice touch of environmental storytelling. Something you can easily pull off without the need of cutscenes of dialogue, just a bit of lore and the ability to explore these places, and you can get your imagination going to how things may have looked like under better circumstances. I love the complexity of the levels and how vertical it gets, both in exploration and in combat. But that complexity also comes with a small downside. Much like boomer shooters of old, the environment can be complex to a fault. In some levels, once you are done fighting, got your key and have to make your way to the next area, it is possible to actually get lost. Or rather, because of the decorations of the levels in some places, it's easy to miss the trees for the forest, aka I found myself struggling to find a switch or a door that could let me advance because the designs of said doors were so subtle I actually thought they were part of the background, and thus I didn't pay attention to it. Or other instances where a platforming puzzle should be obvious, but because either my own incompetence or a failure to figure out what to do, I ended up falling to my death. I'm not saying I should have the infamous hovering markers most modern games often have, but a bit of better signposting could go a long way in making navigation more fun. Having a stretch of time where I'm banging my head against the wall trying to figure out where I'm supposed to go as I sweep the same area multiple times can hurt the pacing of the game, especially if the game is as action-focused as this. Thankfully, this didn't happen too often. If I had to pull out a walkthrough, then it would have been a major issue, but it didn't get to that point. Other than that minor flaw, I will argue Medieval is a fantastic game. Not only is it a spiritual successor to games that came before it, but it also manages to do its own thing, so it stands quite well on its own. I appreciate how this game is both a great example of a ray-traced game, while also being designed to still look amazing on non-RTX cards. This is the kind of thing I wish games like Crysis did instead of becoming a benchmark-only game. So yeah, this is a game I recommend 100%. There's DLC I want to play of it in the future, and if I ever upgrade my PC, you can bet I'm going to play it again, but with all the fancy RTX tech enabled, because it was just that good. Even with the minor flaws with the visual cues as where to go, I still had an amazing experience. For a game that replaces guns with magic, it managed to make sure the spells I used on enemies still packed a punch. Every area of the game felt memorable, and true to the genre, it lent itself to allowing me to think outside the box. And if you still have any doubts about me comparing this game to Quake, you can rocket jump. Or I should say, you can planet jump. Stuff like this very much confirms why, even though the core is to point and click on bad guys to defeat them, boomer shooters have been enjoying this new golden age. Yes, the core gameplay is the same across the board, but it takes talent to still making sure both the shooting feels good and each game gets to truly stand on their own. I'm barely scratching the surface here with this game. There's plenty of others I want to talk about, let alone play, and you can bet we'll be happily looking at them in the near future.